Does the afterlife feature in the Old Testament in any form? And if it does, how does it differ from the Christian concept of heaven?
There are a lot of folks who would say there's no afterlife within the Hebrew Bible. I don't think that's accurate. I don't, and I think the consensus view disagrees with that. And we have a couple of different ways to establish this. One is with a lot of references to Sheol. Sheol is the abode of all of the dead in the Hebrew Bible, and throughout the overwhelming majority of the Hebrew Bible, everybody goes to Sheol. Good, bad, everywhere in between, everyone ends up in Sheol, and it's kind of
That's
a
not very fair.
well, that's what ultimately ends up giving rise to the concepts of postmortem divine punishment and reward in the Greco-Roman period. But in the Hebrew Bible, it's kind of a murky existence. Nobody's sure exactly what it's going to look like, what kind of sociality was there. It's just understood to be kind of a gloomy place. However, from material remains, particularly how people were buried, how people were interacted with after their death, because you still have meals that are shared with the deceased. You have what are called mortuary chapels, where the living can go interact with the deceased. You have petitions that are made to the deceased. And even in the Hebrew Bible, you have things like Saul going to the necromancer of Endor to consult with the deceased prophet Samuel, who is called an Elohim, a god, when he shows up. And so there's a whole cult of the dead. And there's a wonderful book written by Carrie Sonia a couple years ago called Caring for the Dead in Ancient Israel, which is all about how the Hebrew Bible and the material remains outline what they thought about the dead and their relationship with them. But the dead were thought to have access to strategic knowledge. You could go petition them to help you with something, make a decision about something. You could petition them to harass your neighbor who, isn't returning your power tools and things like that. And you shared meals with them. And so there was probably ancestor worship going on alongside worship of God's wife and God and other deities in the earliest periods of Israel. And there's an argument to make, and I think a scholar named Susan Ackerman made it once in print, that one of the things that this King Josiah, who's probably responsible for the earliest layers of Deuteronomy, was trying to do was put a stop to all this other worship that was going on, not because he thought it wasn't legitimate worship, but because he wanted everybody to come to his temple to worship. So it's all about the Benjamins, even 2,700 years ago. And so there was worship of the ancestors. And that was probably, Deuteronomy was probably the initial volley trying to get rid of worship of the ancestors. And so we don't really know what all's going on with the afterlife. It's murky, it's unclear. It probably wasn't a great time. There are different entities that were thought to occupy the land of the dead, the Rephaim, the Yodaim. There are a bunch of entities that were thought to be there that they probably thought were dangerous to some degree. People are buried with what are called apotropaic amulets and things like that. Apotropaic means it wards off evil. So people carried those things around in life and would be buried with them to ward off whatever spookums might be in the afterlife. And what happens in the Greco-Roman period, I mentioned they're changing their worldview based on the fact that they seem to always be under the boot of larger empires. And as they're contemplating the problem of evil, why good things happen to bad people, why bad things happen to good people, they're not seeing the other shoe drop in life. And so the thought becomes, well, maybe it's after this life that God will finally settle the score and make everything right. And so in the Enochic literature, texts like First Enoch and related texts that were written in Aramaic and Greek in the Greco-Roman period Judaism, you have the development of this idea of these wicked angels that are being punished by God. And oh yeah, all the very wicked people in the world are being punished by God as well. And then the righteous people, which is always us, they are being rewarded in the afterlife. We've suffered so much in life, God is going to reward us in the afterlife. And it's not systematic, it's not consistent, But by the time we get to the New Testament, you have three general ideas of a post-mortem divine punishment: annihilationism, where they just cease to exist. There's temporary conscious torment, followed either by salvation or annihilation. So there were different ideas about what happened after that initial phase of divine punishment. And then there's eternal conscious torment. And the New Testament seems to represent, to some degree or another, all three different categories. But it's
Kind
after
of purgatory kind of thing.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is associated with this idea of I forget the word, apocastasis. Shoot, that's not the word. But there's this idea that you go and you get punished until you've paid your debt to God, and then you are purified or whatever. And some of that is in Gnostic ideology. Some people think Paul was a bit of a universalist, because Paul seems to say, like in Second Corinthians, there's somebody in their community who is sleeping with their father's wife or something like that, and Paul says to cut him off, deliver him to the buffetings of Satan, so that his soul can be saved in the last day, which seems to suggest that Satan is there to punish temporarily so that people can then be saved, which might be a universalist position. So all kinds of different perspectives on that are still developing in the New Testament, and it's really early Christianity that finally unifies it all and creates kind of a systematic notion of postmortem divine reward and punishment. But even that is further developed in the medieval period. Dante and others further add to the rich tapestry of all the different things that happen after death.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing to Smart Cookies on YouTube. What else is there? Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And if you really liked what you heard, feel free to become my Patreon. No, my patron on Patreon by going to Patreon and becoming my patron. It's really easy. Just type Smart Cookies Podcast in there. You should be able to find me. Last but not least, I have to thank the absolute legends that are my producers on this show, my existing patrons on Patreon: Aida, Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Gordon, Jurechuk, Lorenzo, Mila, Carmen, Taichi, Goran, and Veronica. Without you guys, this show wouldn't exist. So massive thanks. And yeah, see you in the next episode. Bye.